All right. So this morning, we're in the book called Workplace Grace. It's okay if you don't have it. If you do have it, we're in chapter 3, but this should be a fairly kind of autonomous discussion. But basically we've been discussing how do we evangelize people who don't know too much about the gospel? How do we approach our neighbors when they maybe they're not Christians, they're not really interested in Christianity, and how do we present the gospel to them? And so here, the author here asks 3 questions. They want us to think about how do neighbors see us, like if we're going to present the gospel to them, neighbors or coworkers or friends or family, right? Fill in the blank there. So they use this illustration of being a salesperson. If you're trying to market a product, then you need to kind of answer 3 questions for people. Overt benefit, which means, do people recognize the value of the product? Like, why am I going to buy something that has no value to me? Is there a persuasive credibility, which means, is there a compelling evidence that the product works and isn't going to have damaging effects? And then, is there a dramatic difference? So when I use the product, does it actually work? So let me give you an example. I'm a little scared to use this, actually. So my mom works in how many of you guys have heard of pyramid schemes? They're kind of the hip new thing with a lot of ladies.
I'm going to send the link to this to your mom.
Oh dear, please don't. It's kind of a big deal in a lot of circles where you're selling lotions or selling like skincare products or various things. And for my mom, it's essential oils, which help with, I'm going to be very guarded with how I explain this. You can decide what my feelings are towards it all. They help with like ailments, maybe aches and pains or headaches or things like that. And they can also, like, sometimes you can put them out in the air and they'll help with if you have a cold, or that if you read the website, there's ones that are like, and they'll heal cancer, and that you're like, maybe. Anyways, but as you think about this, so what's the benefit? The benefit is that it's going to help you with aches and pains, and they have lots of testimonies that it does. And persuasive credibility, like, is this product, so it's basically they'll take I guess it's oils from certain kinds of plants, whether it's lavender or something else, and they'll crush it down to get these really refined oils from it. Okay, probably fine. It's not going to kill you, almost certainly, but and probably has some good health benefits. And then, is there a dramatic difference? And so, depending on who you talk to, probably there is. At risk of stepping on other toes, like the Kangen water, if you've talked to Connie. You could go through these same questions. Is there an overt benefit? Is there credibility that this actually is a viable product? Is there a dramatic difference between, I kind of joke with Connie a little bit. I'm sorry, I tend to be a little bit of a cynic in some areas, but like, is there a difference when you drink it? Do you feel better? How do you show that? So anyways, like with any product, these are questions that you would be asking. And so the same principle applies to evangelism. And so as we are presenting the gospel, so let's say you go through the gospel, you're a sinner, your life is broken, you're flawed, you lie, you make these mistakes in your life, and you know they're wrong, and you if you really think about it, you know in your heart of hearts that there's a God and he is not happy with the way you're living because you know that you're not living perfectly, selflessly, and justly in your life. And so you can't fix that on your own. The only person that can fix that for you is Christ because he died for you. Anyways, like however you present the gospel, it's going to sound something like that maybe. And we need to start asking ourselves these questions. Is there an overt benefit? So I'm going to throw this out there now. What is the overt benefit to the gospel? If someone were to ask you, what are the benefits that I get from becoming a Christian? How would you answer that question? Salvation. So what's the benefit of salvation? Well, what if I'm I hear what you're saying. Yep. Go ahead. Yeah.
You know, well,
It's eternal life. The positive. It's not.
The main point the author seems to want us to really get when we ask these questions is we need to tailor how we present the gospel depending on where the people are that we're talking to. Like when Paul is in Athens in Acts 17, he presents the gospel a lot differently than he does when he goes into a synagogue, because he's talking to different people who are at different places and have different mindsets and are from different cultures. And so Paul doesn't just have this rote script that he goes through, the same script every time, depending on who he talks to, he tries to get to know who he's speaking to so he can explain the gospel in the best way to make sense to the people he's speaking to. So when you describe like what the overt benefit is, that might make sense to someone who's who went to Sunday school or who went to Awanas or who has a Christian background. You might need more explanation if you're talking to someone like me when I was a teenager who I didn't know anything about Christianity. So that might sound like the way, if it's just the way you described it, it might sound very strange, and I don't really understand what you're talking about, even though I might, nod politely. I don't really quite get it.
Yeah, and so you're right about the benefits, and this is a key point that I think is a struggle for all of us, at least those of us who have grown up in the church, like I did. It's hard. We have to translate like what you said into a language, a form of communication that our unbelieving neighbors will understand. So heaven, hell, like that language isn't familiar with them other than maybe in kind of a satirical sense of angels and demons and that sort of pop culture sense.
Ralph, were you going to say something? Sammy, could you get him the mic? Or actually, could you make sure? Yeah, that's the only one. Oh, is there anyone online, Lucas? Okay, yeah, go ahead. Is number 1 on, Lucas? Is the mic? It's on. Go ahead. Just turn it up a little, Lucas. Are you sure it's on? Turn on another one. That's the wrong one.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Okay. One thing you often hear in what I went through was becoming a Christian, or believing, is having peace of mind. The weight of sin taken off. When you think about, before I became a Christian, if I were to die, I knew that I would probably go to hell. But when I thought at the time that I was going to die, back in Vietnam, that when I cried out to God, that weight of sin and all the other worries of the world, he took off. And so even though I was still in a dangerous situation, I felt totally different. And you hear that oftentimes from new Christians, well, the weight of sin was taken away, so now I have peace of mind. And, that's biblical. So as far as salvation goes and knowing, I didn't know all that stuff. I didn't grow up in a Christian home either, so I didn't know all the thing about the blood and all of that. And there were really no Christians around to explain anything to me while I was there. But when I cried out for God, save me, he did. And he got me through that whole war until I didn't really hear anything until I got out a year later. And then I was all ready, all ears, and received everything. And there again, it was slow coming because I didn't understand the terminology and a lot of the words that they were using, but I had the eagerness and the desire to learn that because I wanted to know, well, what happened to me. So anyway, that's the question you're asking, what am I getting? Peace of mind, looking forward to a better future in Christ, walking with God. But even today, as a believer, we come through some stressful situations. We still have to go through that. And peace of mind sometimes is there, kind of spotty at times, depending on what the situation is.
Yeah.
But I know we all go through some stressful times, and probably going to go through some more coming up. So I would think that would be the biggest thing for a believer, is to have that weight, taken off your shoulder. You're no longer carrying that. No, you're putting that in God's hands, letting him carry that.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph. That's a powerful answer. I think that speaks to a lot of unbelievers who are feeling very stressed out and anxious and depressed because of the way the world is. That's a benefit.
So
the peace that we have.
So that's a good example. So maybe if you're talking to someone who doesn't have some sort of background on the Christian story, when you talk about what is it that Christianity, what is it that God is offering to the world through his son, Jesus Christ, instead of saying to be saved from hell or to be saved from your sins, which is true, perhaps it'd be better to start with God offers you peace, real peace, peace of mind in your heart, in your soul. He offers you peace because he's going to fix you, and he has a plan to fix this world. And he wants you to join him so you can be part of the new world to come.
Yeah.
And it's not that we're saying something different, it's that we're framing it in a way that makes more sense to someone who doesn't already have a lot of pieces of the puzzle rolling around in their heads from maybe Sunday school or from wherever. But peace is a really good way to frame, this is what God is offering you.
Yeah. And God is going to fix everything.
Yeah.
Well, and
Yeah, go ahead.
what you're saying, though,
Samuel, you bring the microphone.
can't move like we used to. What you're saying, though, is kind of, won't that give people false ideas? That if I receive Jesus, my life is going to be perfect. Not perfect, but it's going to be, I won the lottery. It's going to be more peaceful. Because it's not. Actually,
Right.
when you receive the Lord, you're going to receive a whole bunch of attacks from the other side, from the enemy. So you have to be careful. And I agree. You have to explain that you're broken here, people around you are broken. You're looking to the future. This is all a future. God's going to fix everything in the future.
Right. Exactly.
Because right now, life's just miserable.
Right.
Some people may have it a lot better than others, but it's rough. This life is rough.
Yeah. Well, and it's almost like, as far as our spiritual side goes, it's almost like the patient who has a heart attack on the floor and the ambulance comes. You want the ambulance to come, but the minute it comes doesn't mean that the pain and brokenness in the body is gone. It's the beginning of hopefully a healing process, and there's some surgeries probably that happen. And in a spiritual sense, that's what happens with us. God doesn't magically just erase all of our sin nature and all of our cravings for sin and our brokenness that's part of the fall and part of being sinful humans. But he does begin that process of healing us. And so you're absolutely right. That's a very helpful caveat to say that it's not like you're just suddenly floating on this cloud of blissful just happiness. It is still a struggle to live as a Christian, but you're struggling with God, who is in the process of restoring and renewing and bringing justice into the world, rather than fighting against him.
Yeah, the book says something really helpful. And the book gives some examples of different ways Paul presents the gospel depending on who he's talking to. And the book said that Paul doesn't compromise what he's saying just so he can be accepted. Mm-hmm. The book says he did not change the content of his message. He just packaged it differently, personalizing it to the particular audience he was addressing at the time. So the more you know the people who you're trying to give the gospel to, the better you can explain it in a way that makes sense for who they are and where they're coming from. And that's what the author wants to try to get us to. And the better you know someone, the more you'll be prepared to do that, which is why it's important to know people instead of just this cold call. I don't know who you are, but let me tell you these things about Jesus so you can pray and accept him as your savior, which is not bad, but there's other tools that we have. And the author's big on relationships. And the more you know someone, the more you can explain the gospel in a way that makes sense to that person.
Right. And so the next question kind of becomes, what do we need to know about the people around us in order to share the gospel about them or to them? Like what questions what basic information do we need to know about our neighbors so that we can share the gospel with them? The author goes over a few different examples in a workplace setting, specifically corporate culture and the way that a workplace functions. That would be different if depending on your workplace. It would be different if you're retired and you have different kind of a different culture that you're existing in, but corporate culture is part of it. Another part is the age and life stage of your coworkers or your friends or family, right? Somebody my age is probably going to react to the gospel differently than somebody who's a baby boomer or somebody who's a Gen Xer is like my parents' age, 40s and 50s. That they're going to react differently. And differently even than like a Zoomer, which is the next generation under me, which I find highly ironic, given that we are all now stuck on Zoom.
Who makes up these names?
I do not know, but so understanding what are the defining characteristics of different generations. And so for a lot of your generation, a defining characteristic would be the Vietnam War in a way that has not defined my generation. My generation has been defined by this thing, and the generation below me even more so, and will be very much defined by this pandemic. That understanding those background pieces will help you address what are the questions that people are asking. How can we think about what are you guys' thoughts on either like corporate culture, maybe not just corporate culture, maybe just the different cultures that you're existing in your neighborhoods or family? How does culture, and we can maybe talk a bit more about what that means, but also like age and life stage, how does that help us ask questions or understand the backgrounds of people? Do you guys have experience with that as a helpful tool? Maybe not. Okay. I'll just kind of throw this out here for now then, and we can keep talking about some other examples of what kinds of background information we should have for people.
Well, let me ask you.
Yeah.
I'm in my 50s.
Mm-hmm.
So your generation is steeped into electronics.
Yes.
So how would, and I'm into electronics somewhat.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm not into Facebook or other things. But how would a
Sure.
She just got her first phone, well, it's actually her first serious phone where she's able to call out. Oh gosh. You know?
Yeah, right.
And how do you witness? I mean, what is, when you say that, I'm having a hard time relating to
Right.
that and how that guides your life.
Right.
So other than your generation are always mainly on the phone.
Yeah.
So how does presenting the gospel to that type of generation, or what did you call it?
The generation under me, like Holly's generation.
Just my generation.
Yeah.
Listening to your generation.
Right.
Without sounding like I'm preaching or relate. How would I be able to relate to a technic?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking of.
Perhaps if you wanted to give, like, for example, I mean, some of these differences in generations are really just overdrawn. It's not as though there's some
Right.
hard and fast line between different generations and people all think the same and
And
act differently. But
People are unique within generations.
But with a younger
Yeah.
person, maybe instead of giving them a book to read, you'll send them a link to a YouTube series with videos about the gospel or about a book of the Bible that explains things. Or maybe instead of giving them a small piece of literature that explains the gospel, you'll give them a link to an interactive gospel tract online that explains the gospel that they can look at on their phone,
Right.
or something like that. It's just more of to know who you're talking to, so you can best give the gospel in the most appropriate way that'll work for that person. It doesn't mean that, a 15-year-old couldn't read a book, but
Right.
just saying that the author's trying to get at, the more you know someone, the better you'll understand what they might be more likely to read, or what medium they might be more likely to consume to get the gospel.
And here's another example for working with younger people, my generation and younger, is we are constantly bombarded by advertisements. On every media platform, there's loads of advertisements. And because of that, there's an inherent cynicism towards things that are being sold to us. And so that's part of why you'll hear people talk a lot about buzzwords like authenticity. Well, what does authenticity mean? It means you're honest, you're genuine, you're not just there selling something. And so I would say most people, my generation and younger, have a very sensitive radar for whether you are genuine or not, whether you just are there because you want their money or you want something else from them. And so, and this goes back to the relationship part, but just being on, like, if you have somebody like Holly that you're able to really develop a relationship with, just being honest and being present and showing that you care is huge. And I mean, there's a lot, like Tyler said, people are different within generations. You've got people within the baby boomers. Some are very tech savvy, some are not very so you can't, like, with a broad brush paint a whole generation, but it at least helps maybe see some of the differences. But I've got a group of teens, some families in my neighborhood that I talk to sometimes, and they're not just wanting to be stuck on their phones. I mean, they do spend a lot of time on their phones and playing video games. And sometimes I help them with, like, finding homework assignments because they're trying to help their younger brother because the schools are all remote right now. And so that we're looking it up on our phones, but they're quite happy to sit down and just talk without technology. Like, some are more addicted to technology, but a lot are quite happy to have an honest conversation about life. But here is one of the aspects I would say that's quite defining for my generation, and probably even especially younger, as you get into school age kids, because we're bombarded by not only ads, but also media. There's a lot of questions that are being thrown at kids right now. Questions about racism and questions about government and and questions about the environment and like all of this stuff is being thrown at people. And if you're willing to take the time and honestly answer questions or think through questions with them, it's one of the best ways, I think, to interact with younger people.
So what about a person's testimony? Where,
Sure.
when I received the Lord, I was a teenager, so it's been a few years. But back then, it was a big thing to listen to what other people had gone through and how the Lord worked in their life. Does that stand to today for your generation,
Absolutely.
younger generation?
Sharing your testimony is very powerful because people crave for relationships so much, and they crave for authentic. Well, your testimony is you, and so you're not just sharing logic and facts. That can be helpful, but I think your testimony gives you a genuineness. It tells them like your experience. And that's very significant right now. So I would say maybe your testimony isn't the first thing to share, because you basically, until you've built some trust with them, why would they care? Why would anybody care? But once they trust you a bit, then yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really powerful way to share the gospel.
The more you know the people the better you know the people you're trying to reach, the more effective you can be at trying to reach them. There's a pastor I know in California, and he's very old school, and what his church does for evangelism is all they do is they just go door to door every week. That's what they do. They knock on doors and try and have conversations with people. If that works for him, then that's fine. But I don't believe that's the most effective way to communicate with people today, because I personally don't like people coming to my door. They always come at a bad time, and it's always very annoying. And I just got home from work or something else. So, for example, that's why most of the stuff that our little church does, and we try and give the gospel, is on social media advertising through Facebook and through YouTube, and soon to be through Instagram. But even through then, it's very funny, because when we advertise on Facebook, what we get are people 50 plus, usually women, and that is it. That is it. Those are the people who respond. Those are the people who comment. Those are the people who like. Those are the people who share. And that tells you that a lot of the people who are interested in Christianity and who respond to advertisements or think about things related to the gospel are women who are 50 plus on Facebook. But when you do YouTube, you get very, very much younger people. So this is just a short example of, if you want to reach a culture that doesn't know much about the gospel and that is really cynical about Christianity because of people who've ruined it in people's eyes, and because of charlatans and bad characters, or just not really encountering many Christians, the best way might not be to go knock on someone's door in this culture. Maybe it would in the Midwest or something, but perhaps a better place to start would be through advertisements they can get where they spend a lot of their time, which is on their device.
Right. I mean, basically, social media is like knocking on someone's door, because that's their house in a lot of senses. That on YouTube or Facebook, that's where they're present. So then there's two more aspects that I want to spend the rest of the time talking about. We live now in a pluralistic society, which means that we live in a society where there's not one view of what's true. There's many views of what's true, and which is why our politics are so polarized, among other things. People with extremely different views of what America should be, what the society should be. And that's not just America, by the way, that's all of the West. And connected with that there's biblical ignorance, which because people aren't being raised in church, they're not being raised in Sunday school, you go ask people, who is Jesus Christ? And they give you a blank stare for about 10 seconds and then say, curse word? Like, this is not a helpful question for them. And then you've got this big word called postmodernism, which is basically the idea that people, they don't believe, so it used to be, and there's some caveats here. I'm going to try not to go down this rabbit hole too far, but basically, you have multiple ages. You kind of have pre-modern, which was before the Renaissance, which is the idea that there's angels and demons and spirits and witches and like all of this stuff is out there. If you read like from the Middle Ages, you've got all kinds of crazy stuff going on. And before that, pagan society with Rome, you've got cults and temples and all kinds of stuff. And then you have modernism, where people basically say, that's pretty much all false, and we've got science now. And we know when the rain comes, we know why it comes. It's not because some god or some wizard or hermit out in the hills cursed you. It's because of the rain cycle, the water cycle. Like, and people really started to understand science better after the Renaissance and after the Enlightenment. But recently, in the last 100 years or so, specifically, modernism had this idea that the world was going to get better and better, and science was going to make things better and better. And then World War I happened. And in World War I, people looked at science and said, this is horrible. Science has put us in a wretched place. We don't like where the world is headed right now. World War I and World War II hit and really reshaped the thinking of a couple of very foundational generations. And people said, we're not so convinced by all of the stuff that modernism told us about how we were going to have this utopia and we were just going to all live happily ever after in this kind of scientific wonderland. And so you had a lot of thinkers who said, rather than having this single narrative of either Christianity is true or science is the kind of this God that's going to save you, instead, basically, we will have whatever makes sense to you, whatever is true for you is true. And even if it contradicts what's true for somebody else, you can have different truths, and it's okay. So this is the idea behind postmodernism and kind of where it came from. And so many of our neighbors are postmodernists. Now, I want to caveat that because we as a society, we're a bit fragmented in how we think about truth, because basically everybody knows that 2 + 2 = 4. They're not postmodern in their view of math. They know that when they drop a ball from the top of a 10-story building, it's going to fall. That they're not postmodern in their view of gravity. And so we've held on to a lot of kind of the absolute truth ideas that there are certain things that are always true. Every time you drop a ball from a 10-story building, it's going to fall, unless there's some sort of like tarp or something right next to the wall. Like there are certain things that are basically always true, and you can do them over and over and over again, and they're always going to be true. But in areas of faith and kind of these intangibles of justice and love and church, people tend to say, well, what works for you? Like, you want to do the New Age stuff, you want to do the Christian stuff, that work fine, have at it. As long as you're not hurting anybody, go do that stuff, and I'll do my whatever it is that they're doing. And so we kind of have to understand this mentality and understand how to think through it as Christians. So before I go on with that, that's a lot of information I just dumped on you, I know. So what are your questions at this point before we tackle how do we think through this as Christians? We are on, I just have the Kindle location. We're
Location 690, Demetrius.
we're
See?
6 pages into chapter 3.
I see part 2, part 3, culture, linguistic.
Yeah, go to part 6. Postmodern thinking.
I have a bit of a thought.
Yeah.
Well, we just talked about testimonies and how they can be powerful.
Yeah.
And a Mormon has a testimony, and he believes what he believes, and
Right.
it's true because he feels it in his heart. And then you talk about things like gravity and being true. And so when somebody comes in with their testimony, there's a reality and a non-reality to that. And so sometimes a testimony to me is just, it's not, it can be true,
Mm-hmm.
but it can be a testimony that's completely false as well.
Right.
And so dealing with truth with those people is going to be a whole different thing.
Mhm.
I don't know where I want to go with that, but
Yeah, I think there's a balance between giving our personal experience is a tool, but also being able to, I think people do want to hear credibility. And so using some of the more traditional apologetics of, we believe the Bible is true because we have a lot of Greek and Latin and Hebrew texts that go back thousands, you can look at the stars and see God's fingerprints in the stars or in bats or these other, you can use some of those more logical approaches, but if that's all you use, it won't be as helpful. So using that hand in hand with also earning someone's trust by being there's the old saying of people won't care what you know until they know that you care. And I think that's quite true today. Once they know that you care, then you have an open door to start presenting some logical answers, some biblical answers about their questions. I think there's a few ways that we can approach people who are coming from this truth is relative, truth is defined by you rather than there being an absolute standard. One is we almost start by listening to the questions that people are asking rather than coming in with our own answers automatically, which of course we do have answers about salvation and about Christ and about God and our sin and so all of those pieces. But starting from people's questions, I think, is a really powerful way of trying to help them think through what is true in the world. Because people do have questions. And people, even those who are kind of in the truth is relative camp, I think a lot of people will say that, but it's more of a shield. My experience has been, it's more of a shield, and genuinely they're hungering for truth about racism or the environment or these other areas. And they have legitimate questions that they really want an answer for. And they know that there are certain things that are good and certain things that are evil. So they might say, your truth is your truth, and that's fine. But they also have standards. If you go and use a racial slur with their friend, they're not going to put up with that and just say, oh, well, that's your truth. They have standards of what's good and true. And so as you start to touch those, as you're listening to them and they're listening to you, you will be able to start interacting with, well, why do you believe that this is true? And where do you get that from? And I think, my experience has been you start to touch a void where they don't really have a foundation for why they believe what they believe is just and true. And we can bring that in as Christians and explain, well, I can tell you why racism is wrong. It's not just because some people feel it's wrong or it hurts people, however you define hurt, but because God created us, every human being, in his image as a beautiful creation. And if you slander that, you're slandering God. And so we have a foundation for answering that question in a way that secularists don't. Yeah, go for it, Demetrius.
Just kind of going off of the testimony and culture and generational differences and stuff like that. I think Paul is a great example of how our testimony has to change depending on who we're talking to. If you read through his different letters, his testimony changes. It's not the same every single time. When he goes to Greece and talks to the Epicureans, their questions are about what is the universe? Who is out there? Is there something out there? And so his testimony is, there is this unknown God that you have here is known, and he wants to know you as well. When he's writing to the Corinthians, their questions are more, what can I do now that I'm a Christian? What am I allowed to do? What is permissible? And his responses are more, well, here's an example of my life. My life is full of suffering now. Maybe that's what a Christian should look like. You guys have all this freedom now, but really you're not free. You're actually a slave to Christ. When he writes to the Philippians, their main concern is Paul's suffering. They're so concerned that he's in prison and he's suffering now, and how can this be? And Paul's saying, no, it's okay. I have such great joy and accomplishment in my relationship with Christ. Just because I don't have freedom physically here, my freedom is with Christ, and I have great joy in that. And all three of those things are his testimony about not only answering their questions, but about himself. So when we're looking at different generations and different individuals specifically, it's what they need.
Yeah.
What part of the gospel do they need right now? I mean, just because my testimony includes pain and suffering, maybe somebody has a great life and they don't care about that because they're good.
Yeah.
What do they need God for? Because they have tons of money, they're healthy. What do they care that you had a bunch of suffering and now you don't? Yeah. Or my friend that I spoke to in Washington.
But even in not having a great deal of money and whatever, they can still be the loneliest person on the earth.
It could be, but maybe they're not.
True. You don't know.
Yeah.
You get to know, right?
That's the thing. You need to know what their question actually is. My friend in Virginia, when I went and spoke to him, he had a question about why is there sickness in the world? But that wasn't his actual question. His actual question was, why did my brother get addicted to drugs and die? That was the actual question that he was asking, not just why do people get sick? So like you were saying, it's just having some rote memorization, this is my testimony, is not going to work for everybody. You have to find out who you're talking to and what they need, because Christ fits in every single culture. And we can see that today. There's such a big boom in Asia and in the Middle East, and their cultures are completely different from ours, right, in very dramatic ways. Right. But Christ fits right in there, yeah, in every single culture.
And that's the big point of this chapter, is that we live in a world that thinks a lot differently than Christians do. And you have all kinds of different people of all different kinds of ages, all kinds of different generations, and they all think very differently among themselves. So, and rather than, it's not a bad thing to have a standard, to have a generic script that you like to use if you have a chance to give the gospel to someone. But what the author is trying to get you to think is, another way is to make friends with people, try and get to know people and where they're coming from, and based on who that person is and what his real question is, like Demetrius said, then you can bring Jesus and his gospel to bear on them in their situation. Instead of a rote thing that you say, you have a relationship with someone so you can explain the gospel best to that person. The author has a quote where he says, people will best be able to find Jesus when followers of Jesus bring Jesus to them. The more you understand someone and know someone, which you have to do in relationship, the better you'll be able to explain the gospel to the person, because they'll trust you, you'll know them, etc.
Right. Yeah, trust is so key right now because especially young people are being bombarded by so many different truths, so many different messages that what am I supposed to believe? You watch different news channels, you watch different advertising companies, and everybody has this really compelling, if you buy my product, you'll be saved from everything, cancer included. And you're just left going, this can't be all true. How do I know? The information overload, how do I know what's true? And so we can bring compelling evidence about the Bible, but also having a realness about us and a trustworthiness. And when people trust us, when we earn their trust, then they're much more willing to listen and believe what we say. And so, for example, I work as a public school teacher. It's a little different this year being online, but last year when I was working with students, I had a somewhat of a script, I suppose, that I go through with them. You can't really talk about the gospel, certainly not in class. You have to be very cautious how you do it, even outside of class. But basically what I try to tell students or teachers or admin when I'm having conversations with them is, so say talking to a student, and I've had this conversation dozens of times, is my goal for you is to be successful. I want you to be a leader in your community. That is my job as a teacher. More than you learning math, more than you learning how to read well or write well, I want you to be a leader and an influencer among people. Influencer, by the way, is kind of a great word right now. It's well liked. So this is part of the translation process. You start using some of their favorite words and it works well. I want you to be an influencer. And to do that, I want you to learn how to think well, think critically about the world around us. And so I'm going to ask you questions and expect you to ask me questions. And I want us to be able to have a good conversation because that's how you can grow to think deeply about the world around you. And of course, I have opinions. But my goal isn't to force my opinions on you. My goal is to help you think well, think deeply. And that approach goes over very well. And then I have the permission to talk to them about stuff. And we start talking and we've been able to go to the gospel from there. I don't necessarily go to the gospel first, but within that conversation, trust is built and we're able to, they can respect that I'm not forcing my beliefs on them, but I am asking them to think about certain things. And you start to expose holes in a lot of what the world teaches. And they do have a lot of genuine questions. And I think adults are similar, but I've seen this maybe more with kids more often. Kids are more open typically. Adults tend to be fairly closed. You have to work harder to break into them having a willingness to trust you. So they end, and there's more that we'll get into next week, but he ends by recapping as you think about any time that you're sharing the gospel or sharing Christ with an unbeliever, what is the overt benefit that they're hearing from you? What are they hearing about the value of Christ and the gospel? How can we translate that into something that makes sense to someone who's not coming from a Sunday school background? What's the credibility of the gospel? Why should I believe the gospel over Islam, over Buddhism, over New Age, over just a secular humanism that says that everything came about from a big bang billions of years ago. And not just the kind of logical, intellectual credibility, but also, does your life match what you're saying? I remember you could phrase it like this: does your video match your audio? I don't know if you've ever watched a movie where like the actors are doing one thing and the audio is like 20 seconds ahead or behind. And it's like, wait, what they're saying does not match what they're doing right now. And so we have to think about, does the way we live, and this is where you get the catchphrases like lifestyle evangelism, does the way we live match what we say? When we say the gospel gives me joy or gives me peace, do we act joyful, or are we just grumpy? If we say, I am able to love people better because of the love that Christ gave me, do we really love people better? Like, does our lifestyle and what they're observing in us really match what we're saying? It's not that you don't talk about the gospel, but you also have to live it. Otherwise, and I've heard this many times. I'll never forget last spring when I was working in the high school as a student teacher and had a conversation with several different high schoolers multiple times after school. And one was a Muslim foreign exchange student from Kuwait, and the other was an Indian guy, atheist. And the Indian guy, we were talking about religion and faith, and he said, the biggest reason that I find it hard to believe in Christianity is because I see most Christians as hypocrites. And so those are barriers we have to break down. And part of how we break them down is by our own life, not being hypocritical.
Yeah, it's easy to broad brush people, but when you have someone in front of you who's an honest and decent person who makes known that he's a passionate Christian, it makes it harder to try and impute that broad brush, all Christians are this thing, when the person you see every day is obviously a decent human being. Mm-hmm. And Peter talks about that in 1 Peter 2. Mm-hmm. And so, the author, the last thing he says in the book, as he wraps up, he says, as Christians, we have what people want. We simply need to communicate in winsome ways they can understand. Yeah. So we need to get to invest to try and know people who aren't Christians, so that the more we know them, the better we can explain the gospel to them in small incremental ways, depending on who they are, where they're coming from. Because not everyone's the same. So we need to tailor the way we present the message depending on who we're talking to. That's all the author wants us to see. And I think we get that, but we really need to be reminded of it to realize that people are different. So we need to explain the gospel differently. And the better we know people, the better we can do that.
Yep. All right, let's pray, and then we will have some fellowship time. Lord, thank you for making us co-workers and co-ambassadors in the proclamation of the gospel. I pray that you would help us as we struggle with boldness, we struggle with connection. How do we find people? It's scary dealing with people from different cultures or different generations than us and feeling uncomfortable, not even knowing how to really answer the questions that they have. And sometimes we feel like there's a lot of distance between us and other people. God, I pray that you would give us the confidence that your Holy Spirit is working with us. We're not sent out alone to do evangelism. And help us as we seek to listen and find the balance between being bold and being clear about the gospel, and yet also earning people's trust so that they are willing to listen to what we have to say. And that they would see it's not just us. We're not in it for anything for ourselves, but we are just cherish you. And we want people to see and know what a glorious reality that we have in you. What a glorious life we have in you. And so, God, help us have peace as we go and share the gospel with people, that regardless of how the conversation goes, that you are using us to plant a seed in their heart, and you will produce the change that you desire. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.